This is not a longsword, and this isn't a broadsword. Ah! The nightmare of nomenclature of swords in role-playing and video games. But actually, is it all just rubbish and it doesn't matter? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, when I was younger, I did lots of role-playing games and read lots of fantasy books, and it used to annoy me to hell when I started learning about real historical arms and armour, that very often a knightly one-handed sword might be referred to as a longsword, and that a longsword might be referred to as a broadsword. Man, that really annoyed me. I remember there was like a Hero Quest advert which had something akin to a Viking era sword, and they referred to it as a broadsword, and that annoyed the hell out of me. But you know, sometimes they say that a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, and it turns out this is one of those cases. So I'm sorry to say this, but there are two terrible types of people in our communities. One of those are people who, for the most part, are maybe, you know, doing role-playing games or video games or LARP or whatever, and they get a little bit more knowledge about arms and armour. I was one of those people, okay? I think it's fair to say I probably got more knowledge about arms and armour now, and do you know what? The more you learn, the more you realise that there are exceptions and caveats to just about everything, which is why one of the memes of channels like mine and people like Schola Gladiatoria is, it depends, or what's the context? It's because we need to know more, and very often there isn't a simple black and white answer. And the other type of terrible person is one of my own people, HEMA people, and sometimes HEMA people get so fixated on one particular historical source that they think that that source is the truth, and everything that is said in that holy tome of knowledge is the truth, and anything that disagrees with their holy tome of knowledge must be a lie and evil and must be exorcised from the world. And of course it's complete rubbish, because lots of treatises disagree with each other. So look, fundamentally, nomenclature or names of things is all about communication. Does it explain what I'm talking about to the person either watching this video, reading the book, whatever it is, okay, or just having a chat? And one of the things that comes up is when I refer to chainmail. Apparently, some people unsubscribe from me because I used the evil word chainmail, which will get you burning in the pits of hell. Well, do you know what? It's about communication. If I say chainmail and you know what I'm referring to, yes, we should refer to it as mail. If we go full SCA, as I'd call it, never go full SCA, but if you go full SCA, my lord, and you must write mail with A-I-L-L-E, and if you just write it M-A-I-L, then even that's not good enough and holy enough for the real Puritans out there. But look, it's about communication. If I refer to it as mail spelt one way or mail spelt another way or chainmail, so long as you know the type of defence that I'm talking about, which, let's face it, in the historical record is described by all sorts of names. And sometimes mail isn't mentioned at all, they just talk about a hauberk or a byrnie or a habergion or whatever. It's all about communication if you know what I'm talking about. So, therefore, in the modern world, we have ended up with certain names associated with certain swords. Most people in the modern world would know what I'm talking about if I refer to a longsword. It's this. But if I was talking to Joseph Swetnam, who wrote a treatise in 1617, and I refer to a longsword, it's very likely he's actually referring to something more like this, or sometimes something more like this, which many of you will say, but that's a rapier, Matt. What are you talking about? But is it? Because in his treatise, he actually talks about different techniques for different swords, and he groups longsword and rapier together. He often says rapier or longsword, and that presumably means a long-bladed sword that is either pretty much point-centric or one which can cut a little bit more. That's the general interpretation of that. So a long sword would be a slightly more cutty rapier by modern standards, and a rapier would be an almost doesn't really cut at all kind of rapier, and is mostly a thrusty rapier. But this, a rapier, is a weapon that more or less comes from Italy, and yet in Italy they referred to it largely as spada, which just means sword. And in fact, if we go over to Germany, Meyer in 1570 describes a rapier that isn't really like this at all. It's more like a side sword. It's shorter and broader. So the names meant different things to different people in different times. To confuse it even further, if I put the longsword, as I would call it, down for a second, and that's not what Silver would call that, a two-handed sword, incidentally. This is commonly in the modern world referred to as a basket-hilted broadsword. Okay, this is one of the new Royal Armouries replicas, incidentally, or at least a prototype of it. And this is a 37-inch blade. That's really long. That means that in Joseph Swetnam's treatise, he might refer to this as a longsword rather than a short sword, which confusingly doesn't mean a particularly short sword. It means, in George Silver's time, for example, it means a backsword as opposed to a rapier, because rapiers are often longer than basket-hilted swords. But here's the problem. This has a 37-inch blade, which means that the blade is actually as long as some rapiers are. So unquestionably, people in the modern world will refer to something like this as a rapier. But later on, small swords were referred to as rapiers, and a so-called short sword, but it's not a short sword, it's a basket-hilted broadsword, can be as long as the rapier. So it's not shorter than a rapier necessarily. So it gets incredibly confusing because you can have swords which have broad chopping blades, which might have longer blades than some swords which are usually, like rapiers, thought of as having long thrusting blades. But small swords are quite short. But you shouldn't refer to a small sword as a short sword, because normally if you say a short sword, well, if you're talking to George Silver, he might think you mean a basket-hilted broadsword, or if you're referring to a short sword to most people, they might think you're talking about a hanger or some kind of short sidearm, like a cinquedea or something like that. So it gets incredibly confusing. Now, broadsword as a word, which I hated in my teenage years because I thought it was complete fantasy, is actually 100% correct. So absolutely, this type of sword was referred to, for example, by Zachary Wilde in 1711, English treatise, as a broadsword. So it's perfectly correct to call this type of sword a broadsword. The fact that some sources might call it by something else is kind of irrelevant. It's okay to call this a basket-hilted broadsword if you know what I'm talking about. Is it okay to call this a broadsword or a longsword? In some situations, yes, but bear in mind it might lead to confusion. Most people in the modern world will refer to this as either a knightly sword, perhaps a side sword because it's got a fingering. I think that's a bit superficial. But perhaps most correctly and most accurately to most people's definitions these days, an arming sword. And yes, arming sword is a period term. It's found in the early 1400s in English literature. But most sources don't refer to these as arming swords. Most sources just call them swords. Most sources just call this a sword. Most sources, certainly Italian sources, just call this a sword. And indeed, if we go all the way back into the early medieval period, most sources would just call this a sword. However, sometimes we do have descriptive terms. A long sword is just a sword that's long. A broadsword is just a sword that's broad. So it's incredibly confusing. But what I would advise to you is to concentrate on communication. What do most people call these things? How can you convey what you're trying to explain to the other person? Imagine that you're talking in different languages. How can you be most clear to another person so that they understand what you're talking about? And also remember that the historical sources are incredibly diverse in their descriptions. One source might call this a short sword. One source might call it a backsword, even though it's got two edges. One sword might just call it a basket hilt. And one source might call this a long sword because it's a long blade. And one source, that would be like Swetnam, and one source like Zachary Wilde might call this a broadsword. So this one sword can go by multiple names. This can go by multiple names. A Viking might call it leg biter or some other fanciful name. This can go by multiple different names, and yes indeed, even rapiers, as I refer to them on this channel, are very often referred to by various other names. There's probably about a dozen different names for swords like this in the 16th and 17th centuries. So don't get too caught up in your particular source, your particular period, or pedantry. Okay? Don't be a massive pedant, because the more you learn, the more incorrect you realise you probably were before. Anyway, I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be. I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Take care of yourselves. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.